Russia wants an explanation from the UN over its use of heavy force in Ivory Coast, which is currently gripped by a civil conflict. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has questioned if it was legal for international peacekeepers to support one of the presidential claimants. UN and French troops bombarded targets around the residence of incumbent President Laurent Gbagbo in the city of Abidjan. The UN says its raids were carried out to protect civilians. Now, forces loyal to the internationally recognized winner of the presidential poll, Alassane Ouattara, have since claimed to have captured the palace, with Gbagbo now negotiating the terms of his departure. He had been refusing to cede power ever since losing last November's election. Hundreds now have been killed during a week of fighting in the country. Let's get more on this now and talk live to John Loughlin from the Institute for Democracy and Cooperation in Paris for more details. And so the UN and allied forces are already busy, as we know, in Libya, but here they are sticking their nose into the conflict in Ivory Coast. What's their business here, do you think?
That's a very good question, but the comparison with Libya is quite a good one. I think a lot of people around the world understand that there is a civil war going on in Libya, that there are two sides even to that conflict. In other words, that there are people who support Colonel Gaddafi. The same is true of Ivory Coast. The situation in Ivory Coast is the product of a very long, protracted crisis which has been going on now for more than 10 years and which involved a civil war in the middle years of the last decade. And it's a crisis which has numerous causes, many of them deep-seated. They include the colonial past, they include immigration and so on. But basically the crisis has crystallized around a rivalry between two men, as you said in your report, Laurent Gbagbo and Mr. Ouattara. What business is it of the West? In my view, none at all. And yet the West, in this case France, but by means of the United Nations, has got into the habit of intervening systematically in other people's conflicts. And I think what the Ivory Coast intervention shows, because after all we are now in a situation where there is bloodshed, and has been now for several weeks, is that international intervention simply doesn't work. We were told that international intervention would be to protect civilians, and now we see the UN forces themselves entering the battle between the two sides. In other words,
when you say that international intervention doesn't work here, even in an area that has a legacy of conflict such as Ivory Coast, a UN military chief says that the recent strikes on Abidjan were authorized by this so-called UN resolution, but Russia has questioned the legality of these bombardments. Let's listen for a moment to what the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had to say about this.
The UN peacekeepers and supporting French forces in Ivory Coast have started military action, taking the side of Mr. Ouattara, carrying out airstrikes on the positions held by supporters of Mr. Gbagbo. We're now looking into the legality of this situation, because the peacekeepers were authorized to remain neutral, nothing more. We've requested an emergency briefing in the UN Security Council. We will keep looking into the matter.
Now, as you were saying, this such international intervention does not work. But are the peacekeepers here actually sticking to their mandate? Because, like the resolution on Libya, their job is to, quote, protect civilians. Is that what you're seeing here?
Well, no. What you're seeing is French soldiers shooting government forces in order to bring the rebels to power. You know, let's be frank about this. The world of mandates, the world of legalization, legitimacy and so on, this is all shadow play. The reality is that France has soldiers in Ivory Coast, and France has declared unequivocally its support for Mr. Ouattara and its desire to see Laurent Gbagbo being overthrown. So there could be no clearer illustration of the fact that France's intervention in this is political and not humanitarian. So the fact that they happen to be wearing blue helmets is basically irrelevant. That's just for the form. They are intervening in order to bring to power a particular man.
So, okay, so you're, despite what's being said by French officials and the UN, you're saying this has nothing to do with the so-called humanitarian mission?
Absolutely nothing. And in any case, we know that France is not neutral in this political crisis, because France has said repeatedly and explicitly that it wants Laurent Gbagbo to step down. So there is absolutely no shred of neutrality about France's position. And yet these UN troops that we hear about are in fact, of course, French troops, and they take orders from Paris. They don't take orders from the United Nations, they take them from Paris. And my concern about this intervention, quite apart from the fact that it, as with other interventions, in my view, makes things worse, is that it fatally damages the authority of the United Nations, because nobody now is ever going to believe that a United Nations intervention in the future is neutral, when we can see a United Nations intervention, as in this case, being used for explicitly political purposes.
Well, there are some that say the United Nations has already done more than enough to already soil its reputation, but we're getting reports now that Laurent Gbagbo is possibly negotiating his surrender. Would you take any stock in this? And when it comes to negotiating his surrender, what kind of terms do you think would be discussed?
I have to say I'm sceptical, but I'm not really an expert and I'm not on the ground. The reason I'm sceptical is that it's the French Foreign Minister himself who has announced this, who's made this announcement about President Gbagbo, or ex-President Gbagbo, negotiating his surrender. This may just be a tactic to create the impression that he is on the way out. I don't know. It could be true. It's difficult for me to say at this distance.
John Laughlin from the Institute for Democracy and Cooperation in Paris. Thank you.